Hello everyone and welcome to the latest Work Foundation event, which today is focused on the latest UK labour market data in the context of next week's budget statement from the Chancellor of the Exchequer. My name is Ben Harrison. I'm Director here at the Work Foundation. We're a research and policy think tank which is part of Lancaster University. We're committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid, secure employment, and our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural disadvantage within the labour market, as well as the interrelationship between health and work. In terms of the event today, then, when the Chancellor steps up to deliver her budget statement next Wednesday, she'll do so against a backdrop of deep political and economic uncertainty, as well as persistent pressure on the public finances. But she'll also be doing so at a time when the UK labour market is showing worrying signs of decline, which, if they were to continue, would risk further undermining the public finances and wider economy, as well as impacting the lives of workers and employers across the country. Having seemingly stepped back from a manifesto-busting decision to raise general taxation, the focus for next week's budget is really going to be on the room to manoeuvre that the Chancellor feels that she has in order to remain within her own budget rules, sustain investment in public services and support economic growth in the future. So what can we expect from that budget statement next week? And in particular, what should the Chancellor be prioritising to improve the labour market and ultimately get closer to the government's own ambitions to drive up living standards, alleviate poverty and boost employment? To discuss those questions, I'm delighted that we're going to be joined with a fantastic panel of contributors today, including Suren Thiru, Economics Director at the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, Helen Barnard, Director of Policy Research and Impact at Trussell, and Duncan Weldon, an economist, broadcaster and writer. Before we hear from our panellists, I just want to provide a brief overview of the latest ONS data on the labour market that was released last week, as well as new inflation data that was released just this morning, which will hopefully help provide some additional context for our discussion as a whole. So one of the big stories emerging from the latest data is this slow rise of unemployment that we've seen through the course of 2025, and it's now up to 5.0%. That's the highest level that it's been in the last 4 years. And we've also begun to see long-term unemployment creeping up too, in part as a result of having falling vacancies over the last year, which now means we have a more competitive jobs market. So for every vacancy, there's 2.5 job seekers on average. According to the ONS, there are now 691,000 young people aged 18 to 24 who are economically inactive and not in education. And overall economic inactivity due to long-term sickness remains stubbornly high at 2.82 million. On wages, while we have seen nominal wages increase by 4.6% on the year, that just equates to an annual real wage growth of around 0.5%. And despite forthcoming legislation to ban exploitative zero-hour contracts, the number of people on these arrangements has actually increased in the latest data to around 1.2 million, with women and young workers aged 16 to 24 composing the biggest part of that rise. In terms of this morning's inflation data, there was some relatively positive news as the rate of inflation fell for the first time in 5 months, dropping to 3.6% in October. And that appears to have mainly been driven by a decrease in the rate of growth for gas and electricity prices. But it's important to note that food, not including drinks, did rise by 4.8% on the year. The IMF has suggested that UK workers are due to face the highest level of inflation in the G7 over the coming years, and that's going to continue to put pressure on the least well-off in particular. A recent Work Foundation survey found that just 34% of workers were expecting an above-inflation pay increase this year, compared to 69% of high-paid workers. So, with all of that context in mind, I'll now hand over to our speakers to provide their initial reflections on the UK labour market and what we might expect to see at the budget next week. Once we've heard from each of them individually, we'll then open the conversation out. If you'd like to submit a question for the discussion, please do so through the Q&A panel on Zoom, but I'll remind you of that a little bit later as well. But for now, I'll hand over to you, Suren, for your initial reflections.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to you and the team for the invite to join me for this session this afternoon. I think my sort of initial reflections on some of the data you provided is that and I would say alongside some of the recent GDP figures that we've seen over the last couple of months, and the quarterly figures out last week, is that the economy really has no real momentum leading into the budget. And that's in marked contrast to what we saw at the first part of the year. And I think what we're seeing at the moment in particular is the budget, both last year's and this year's budget, casting quite a long shadow over the economy. And we're seeing that impact both consumers, also businesses as well. Both are more cautious to spend and invest. And just firstly, looking at the labour market data that you ran through, I think you are seeing some of the impact of last year's budget and the increased national insurance which came in April this year on some of the data, particularly young people. Think of the type of work that they do, the first job, and some are in lower paid employment. Also, I think you're seeing some other unemployment data as well. Payroll employment has fallen very sharply in retail in particular, and that again suggests that national insurance increase is having a real impact on the wider economy. And I think what we're also seeing now in some of the data, and we see in our own sort of quarterly business confidence survey, is that businesses are much more reticent to employ more people, and their plans for over the next year or so have also been tempered down because I'm concerned about the impact of last year's rising costs, but also potential more tax rises to come as well. Moving on to the inflation figures, and as you said, there is some reasonable news there in that inflation has fallen for the first time. I think in about 5 months. That's clearly good news. But I would say it's when you look at some of the reasons behind that, the fall, largely it's due to what economists call base effect, so a small increase in energy bills in October this year versus what we saw last year. And of course, inflation is still almost double the Bank of England's 2% target. So clearly, households aren't really necessarily seeing the benefit of any easing in headline inflation. And in particular, what you see in some of the breakdown data, food inflation in particular, has increased as well. So not many people are going to really see the benefit of that downturn in inflation. And that obviously together with the downbeat GDP figures, that leaves quite a uncertain and challenging backdrop to the budget next week. And I think a big challenge for the Chancellor is she's been pulled in two directions. There's obviously the fiscal, the public finances challenges on the one hand, but also needs to grow the economy as well, which on the other hand as well, which again, she's really struggling with that trade-off. And I think we're going to see some interesting things, particularly around tax, and obviously there's a lot of things being trailed over the last over many weeks. I'm not sure if there's been any taxes that haven't been trailed over the last couple of weeks. From the Institute point of view, we are looking for the government to look at ways of simplifying the tax system and looking at ways of making it give much more clarity around the future path of public finances. With that, I'll hand back to you, Ben, and I look forward to the discussion.
Brilliant, thank you, Suren. That's really interesting. I'm going to come back to you during the course of the conversation to sort of talk a little bit more about lessons from last year's budget. But Helen, I'll turn to you now for your initial reflections.
Thanks. So I think the analysis that was in the Mayfield review that was out a couple of weeks ago is a useful starting point when we're thinking about the labour market. And that was very clear. The labour market isn't in crisis. There are some long-term problems we definitely need to fix, but it's not a crisis. We still have near historic high employment rate. When you look at spending on welfare, non-pensioner welfare is at a very similar rate now as it was in the late 2000s, and it's predicted to stay pretty stable. And across recent history, it's been perfectly normal for about 1 in 5 working age adults to be classed as economically inactive. Obviously, the composition has changed, but this isn't a massive step change. But we shouldn't downplay the fact we have some very serious issues. In particular, I mean, for decades since the 80s, we have a lot of people out of work due to long-term sickness, and we're not doing well by international standards at tackling that. So I think I would highlight a couple of the big problems that we see in our labour market. So the first is work isn't providing a very reliable route out of hunger and serious hardship for too many people. So we are seeing a growing number of people who are having to turn to food banks who are in work. Literally people who are trying to work out, how do I fit in a visit to the food bank in between shifts, because work and social security are not taking them to a place they can actually afford to put food on the table and pay the bills. The second is that our labour market is a very welcoming place for a lot of disabled people and carers. There are too many who can't access work at all. And when people are in work, they are disproportionately likely to be stuck in low-paid work, even if they have the skills and qualifications to do more. So we need to do a lot more to tackle those issues. So we're kind of seeing plans to overhaul employment support, which are looking in many ways very positive, and we need to engage a lot more disabled people in high-quality voluntary support. But the area that has been not acted on by successive governments is tackling employer-side barriers to work, particularly for disabled people and carers. Going back to the Mayfield review, it highlights that. It suggests some initial steps, but it's all about gathering evidence, work with employers who want to make progress. The danger is we see yet another government that ducks that question of what is the action that will create a significant shift on the employer side that will open up good quality jobs for people who are currently shut out. I think the last thing I'd say is there is a really worrying tendency, I think, to think that welfare reform means cuts, and that if you reduce people's living standards even further, that will somehow revitalise the labour market. And actually, we're in a point now where more than half of people on universal credit already can't afford to eat properly, and enormous numbers of people are falling into very serious hardship, and that is damaging their health and pushing them further away from the labour market. And we're seeing, for instance, the conversation about young people, proposals to remove the health element of universal credit for disabled people under 22, which is justified by saying we can put the money into the youth guarantee. But actually making those young people even poorer and hungrier, scared, is not going to turn around youth unemployment, is not going to help them build careers. So I think there is something really fundamental. We need people to be able to put food on the table, to put data on their phone, to pay the rent and afford the bus fare to get to a job interview, if we want any of the other reforms to make a difference and our labour market and economy to have more momentum and to be firing on all cylinders. So in the coming budget, I think we need to see some pretty significant action to address living standards at the very bottom for people who are literally facing hunger. And the most important step the Chancellor can take to start doing that is to fully remove the two-child limit on benefits. And that is likely to bring fiscal and economic benefits because it will reduce pressure on public services, because we aren't damaging people with that level of hardship to the same degree that we are at the moment. And we are helping more parents be able to stabilise their finances, which helps people get back to work, engage with support, and progress in their careers, which is what we all want to see. I will stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen. And Duncan, I'll now come to you, and then we'll open up the conversation.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, everyone that's gone before me. I'll just say three things, I think, to kick us off. I'll start with the sort of overall state of the British economy as we head towards this budget. And I think what's actually, really quite striking about it, when you strip out all of the drama and I try and take off my journalist trying to write an exciting story hat, is how much continuity there is about the state of the economy. The British economy is growing something like 1 to 1.5 percentage points a year. And yes, growth seemed a bit faster in the first half of 2024 and has slowed in recent months, it seems, 2025 and has slowed in recent months, although we had a similar picture in 2024 with faster growth in the first quarter, slowing in the second. The similar picture in 2023, actually, which nowadays makes me think maybe the Office of National Statistics is somehow messing up the seasonal adjustment. But, the overall state of the economy is this sort of sluggish growth, the kind of growth we've really experienced since the late 2010s into the 2020s, excluding the pandemic and the rapid recovery from the pandemic. Inflation is, slightly better news today, but still too high. There's been a lot of attention and drama in the gilt market, the market for British government debt, many excitable stories written in January, a few more in July, a few more at the end of last week when we see these spikes. But the big picture is, the interest rate on British government debt is still roughly where it was in January, still roughly where it was this time last year. It's around this 4.5% mark it's been in. Big story is sluggish growth, continuity. So why are we expecting quite a big budget? we're expecting, quite a big budget because the Office of Budget Responsibility looks like it's going to take an axe to its productivity forecasts for the medium term, take productivity assumption down by 0.2, 0.3 percentage points. Doesn't sound like much, but that's enough to put maybe a 20, maybe a 25 billion pound gap in the government spending plans. I think the important thing to acknowledge is this downgrade in productivity doesn't really reflect anything that's happened over the last year. It doesn't reflect Trump and trade war or anything happening in the global economy. It's just the Office of Budget Responsibility for the second time in a decade, really, sort of catching up with reality, acknowledging it has consistently been too optimistic about the medium-term prospects for the British economy. So that's my first thing. We're in this sort of roughly where we were last year in many ways. Talk briefly about the labour market, because I think, I agree with what everyone else has said. There are some worrying signs of a slowdown. I think my big takeaway from the latest wage growth figures, the latest inflation figures at the moment is we have seen quite a big, wedge open up because of the national insurance contributions hike on employers last year. Quite a big wedge open up between the costs to employers of employing staff and how much money those staff are receiving. And we're almost in the worst of all possible worlds at the moment when, we've got nominal wage growth of 4.5% plus higher national insurance contributions plus, new employment rights coming in. Employers feel it's quite costly to employ staff. We're seeing hiring fall down, vacancies fall down, but the staff themselves, workers, are seeing very low real wage growth. So people aren't feeling better off. That's a very difficult position to be in. And then finally, in terms of what we're looking at this budget last week. Now, if we'd been having this conversation a week ago today, we'd be having a very different one. We'd be talking about a government that was preparing to breach manifesto commitments, to put up income tax. That all changed towards the end of last week when the briefing changed. It now looks like we're getting what is being referred to as a smorgasbord of small tax rises rather than one big tax rise. That strikes me as a government which doesn't have a huge amount of ambition at the moment. I always feel if you're going to do a big tax rise, it makes more sense to do one of the big three: national insurance contributions, VAT, or basic rate of income tax. When we get this sort of smorgasbord approach, I feel politically it becomes more difficult for the government, as each of these individual taxes they choose to raise will have its own lobby groups who will often be very loud. We saw some of that last year. It risks a bit more economic efficiency, but I think my final point is, and this is a pessimistic point, I think the government clearly feels, given where it is in the polls, given the sort of botched talk of a leadership coup earlier last week, that it doesn't have much political capital. It doesn't feel it can take a big risk on breaching its manifesto. And I think that's going to lead to quite a cautious budget at a time when what we really need is a more ambitious one.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Duncan. And if I can just ask everyone to turn their cameras on now, we'll open up the conversation. Some fantastic reflections there, which give us a lot to go at, I think, over the next sort of 40 minutes or so, 35 minutes or so. And where I kind of wanted to begin, based on something you just said, actually, Duncan, or sort of emphasised really around this idea that we've really had quite a sort of stable picture in lots of ways when it comes to the economy. I think you could almost say that as well about the labour market too, taking Helen's point that it isn't all doom and gloom, but nevertheless, there've been these quite stubborn and persistent challenges that look like they may be getting worse. And I thought I'd come to you first, Helen, because you made quite a powerful point, I thought, around the fact that for too many people, really, work isn't providing this route out of poverty. And it would be interesting to get your reflections on sort of within this first year, or a little bit more than a first year of the Parliament, where you think government is sort of heading in the right direction. You referenced the Mayfield review. There's been other areas as well, I'm sure. But where you still think there's sort of outstanding action that should be prioritised, and potentially the budget provides an opportunity to kickstart some of that.
Yeah, I think in the first year we've seen quite a lot of very positive steps. I mean, in terms of kind of really longer term drivers of this, the Employment Rights Bill I think, which should, when it kicks in, start to deal with some of the insecurity, because that is a lot of what we see with people in work. It's not really about hourly wages all the time. It's about not having a steady income because you're doing shift work and agency work. So that employment rights bill, obviously there are pros and cons, but it should help with that driver. Similarly, the renters' rights reform, trying to deal with that intense insecurity in the private rented sector. And again, we see about 40% of people at food banks either are or have been homeless in the last year, and that has been going up. So those are two big set pieces of legislation, which as they kind of take effect should help with some of this. Similarly, things around planning. I mean, the government, in a sense, has been doing some very big long-term things, which they will almost certainly not see the benefit of, but need to be done. And then some kind of smaller cost of living at the bottom things. So the expansion of free school meals, for instance, it's not a game changer, but it will really help some of those families on universal credit. Similarly, expansion of the warm homes discount. There's been a couple of tweaks to universal credit, which are going in the right direction. So we saw a kind of year of promising first steps, was the phrase we kept using. What we then saw was this kind of botched attempt to suddenly slash disability benefits in a bit of a panic. And that, I think, did a lot of damage to trust and relationships. And also, actually, the DWP was coming up with a really sensible, well-considered package of reforms and was getting lots of buy-in. And suddenly that kind of extraordinary episode slightly kind of kicked their legs out from under them, and they're trying to get them back. I would say that where we haven't yet seen the government go where we need to, I think two big things are we need to see something much more significant around the adequacy of social security. So the single biggest driver of people facing hunger, which we saw go up from 11 million to 14 million in just 2 years, from 2022 to 24. You know, I was genuinely quite surprised. The single biggest driver is social security isn't doing its job. We need to see a much bigger step to make that more adequate. And the second thing is the employer side of the labour market. So we can get better employment support, we can get better security until job design catches up with the number of disabled people you now have in the population. I think we're going to carry on struggling. But that is very hard to shift. But I think that's where we need to see them put a lot more emphasis than we have so far.
Brilliant, thanks, Helen. That's really helpful. And just to say to everyone joining the call, please do submit your questions as well through the Q&A tab, and I'll do as good a job as I can to get them to our panelists. So I thought I'd come to you next, either to build on some of the things that Helen's just reflected on there, but also, I guess, to Duncan's point, as you were reflecting, now that sort of tax rises seem to be, or major tax rises, or major tax reform may be off the table, we may see this more smorgasbord approach. Just how sort of limited is the room for manoeuvrability that the Chancellor then has to maybe address then some of the bigger issues that Helen's just been talking about?
It's, I mean, I think it's fairly limited. I mean, and it depends what she does. So Duncan made a point in his introduction about the downgrade productivity, which potentially is quite a big issue for her, the budget, but it also depends on what approach she does with leaving, how much headroom she leaves herself. Because a big issue over previous years has been we've been in this constant cycle of having a target, setting policies that go almost up to the target and not leaving any real wiggle room, even in normal times. And of course, not really in normal times at the moment. There's a lot of external headwinds and uncertainties there. So maybe that she tries to go a bit further this time. But of course, as Duncan mentioned in his introduction, they've obviously rode back on some of the potential big things they can do. Income tax was the one that's obviously was trailed as near certainty a couple of weeks ago, and now it's obviously been reversed. And I think and we obviously talked to a lot of businesses, and they say, I guess, three things when they talk about the budget and the wider sort of picture is things are too uncertain at the moment, it's too expensive and too difficult. And the great word that both you, Ben and Duncan, used was a smorgasbord, which is a great word, but it's an absolute nightmare for businesses. And I think that's a big challenge, as much as there's issues around what taxes go up. And of course, national insurance rise was a huge issue. And we've seen the after effects of that. I think the fact there is so little clarity about the path forward for tax, for the public finances, And also, and I guess in addition to that is the complexity of the tax system as well. That's creating its own issues around not least the tax take itself, but also for businesses to navigate that. And that's a real challenge. So we hope to hear more about that in the budget, as well as obviously around the tax rates itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Suren. And Duncan, I mean, again, building on that, is there a risk in all of this that the government is essentially going to run out of time to sort of see the sort of dividends of some of the longer term things that Helen sort of described? But I sort of remember the last election, Keir Starmer sort of making a very big play that he was choosing to pull the lever of growth, and that was going to be the kind of thing which would ultimately rescue both public finances and the sort of wider economy. And they've taken some pro-growth steps. But I guess, is it enough? And given what you described in terms of the sort of cautious budget that we might see, is it, are the government at risk of sort of almost running out of runway on some of this stuff?
I mean, yeah, you sort of wonder why no previous government has pulled this big lever, marked growth. You'd have thought they would. No, I mean, the government bet an awful lot on growth. Growth was what was going to, growth was the distinguishing factor. They were going to be the government of sort of sensible grown-ups, almost technocratic at times. But I think their sort of theory of growth, in as much as they had a theory of growth, was firstly that there was going to be a huge return to stability. This idea that, the previous government had been through however many chancellors and prime ministers in the space of a few years, of having this big majority, of having a stable government in place, that big enough majority, it looked like it was going to last 10 years. Just the very idea that you had this stable government and this stable policy framework would crowd in a bit of investment. And, they have done some very, very sensible pro-growth things, slowly but surely. The planning reform stuff, both on housing and in particular on infrastructure, is a very good idea. They've put in place very sensible capital spending plans, and they're not, cutting those to make the numbers add up. But all of this stuff on planning reform, on government capital investment, on slowly, step by step, realigning a bit with the European Union in certain places. All of this stuff is sensible. All of this stuff you would expect in the long run to increase business investment. But I think, you're really looking at stuff that doesn't pay off until the 2030s at best. And in the meantime, I think where the government has gone wrong, to criticise them, I think after they won that election, there was quite a big gap between the election in the summer and then a budget which was in November and very end of October, start of November. And we had 5 or 6 months of the government talking up worst inheritance of all time. Things are really grim. You could see business and consumer confidence falling while we had these 4 or 5 months of the government saying everything is awful, and huge speculation about which taxes are going to go up. We finally got through that. We got quite a messy rise in employers' national insurance contributions, which doesn't break the letter of the manifesto, but I think does break the spirit of it, which surprised a lot of businesses. And then, as we were just hearing from Suren, they'd left themselves so little fiscal headroom that the moment a few things went wrong, we found ourselves in the run-up to March, once again, having a long conversation about where is the axe going to fall, which taxes might go up. And then I feel we've been doing it again since August. So there might be all of this sensible medium-term capital spending and planning reform in place and slow realignment with the EU, which does matter. But in the short run, we've had 15 or 16 months, most of which has been speculation of how fiscal policy is going to change. It hasn't felt very stable. And I don't think that's conducive to growth, and it's not a very good environment for medium and larger businesses.
I think that's a great point, Duncan. Absolutely. And I want to move us into some of the individual areas around the labour market. But Suren, just briefly on that point Duncan raises, is the only way to stave off some of that instability in the sort of build up to these fiscal statements, other than sort of changing the fiscal rules themselves, the Chancellor's fiscal rules, is it to build that headroom in then? And are we therefore likely to see next week an attempt to create that headroom and not allocate all of it to new expenditure and new investments?
I think that is part of the solution. I also think there's other areas they could look at, for example, having one fiscal event. I mean, sure, you mentioned the budget last year, but the mess around the spring statement was not helpful at all. And I think something like that would work. I would also think there's there is within the government's gift probably more clarity around the path of things like the public finances. And you look at some other countries, I think Denmark's a reasonable example. I know there's differences between different countries of where they provide a sort of clear sort of roadmap of spending, the ceiling for spending, the road for tax, all these sort of things. I think something like that would also be quite helpful to businesses as well, and indeed the wider economy.
Absolutely. Just moving us into then sort of, I want to take us through some of the sort of headline issues that we do see as challenges to the labour market. And given we've had a couple of questions around disability benefit cuts and trying to support more of disabled people into sustained employment, I'd like to kind of start with this issue around health-related economic inactivity, which the figures sort of remained around a kind of near record 2.8 million or so, but it has dominated quite a lot of the political discourse, and we've seen some major strategic reviews. Helen, you mentioned the Mayfield review, which is around stemming the flow of people out of work when they suffer an episode of ill health or become disabled. We've also seen the kind of Get Britain Working initiatives as well. And I just wondered whether we sort of feel like the scale and the pace of interventions around this space match the challenge that has been articulated, and whether we're likely to see, therefore, progress made by the end of the Parliament. Helen, it'd be good to get your reflections. And I guess in particular, you mentioned this prospect of further disability benefit cuts. Do we think that is a realistic proposition coming next week, given the wider the choices that the Chancellor has to face?
So on that one, no, we're not expecting there to be cuts to disability benefits in the coming budget. I think there is, although most of the previous cuts were removed, they are still freezing the health element of universal credit for new claimants, which over time is going to drive up hardship for that group, but it will be a slow burn. The other one is this potential cut for under 22s, which just feels weirdly damaging. No, I mean, my sense is what they're going to do is wait until the TIMS review of personal independence payments runs its course over the next year. I imagine they will do some more work in the background and then come back next autumn with, I imagine, a revised plan. I think the key is, I think, so there is a good way to reduce the amount we spend on disability benefits by genuinely tackling the drivers. So by actually helping more disabled people into good quality work, by doing more on housing costs, by kind of genuinely improving people's lives in such a way that they need less support from the system. And my sense is a lot of the government's heart is they would like to do it that way. The trouble is it is slower and less predictable than just slashing benefits. So I think there is going to be something for me about whether, and what they're doing on employment, they have lots of really good pilots. There seems to be a real kind of another smorgasbord of pilots and trailblazers, all of which seem to be going in the right direction, joining up services, local level support. But it feels as if you are getting quite small scale action there, whilst the bulk of the system continues down a route we know doesn't really work, which is very generic support from job centres by and large, and a very big stance on sanctions, which genuinely drives people away from the labour market, not towards it. So I think there is something for me. Can they accelerate the speed at which they reorient the mainstream system rather than just have lots of pilots, which are great where they are? And can they hold their nerve that you can create improvements in a way that is positive for the individuals concerned and doesn't do damage? I think next autumn is when we're going to start seeing some of this stuff kind of rubber hit the road on it, and we'll see where they've come to.
Yeah, thanks for that, Helen. That's really helpful. Duncan, just building on that, and given what you were describing around the sort of environment facing employers and the sort of pressures that they feel under, it struck me that sort of the Mayfield review in particular tried to strike quite a sort of pragmatic approach around some of this, recognising some of those challenges, but nevertheless that ultimately employers would need to change their practice. We've had a question from Yvonne Clark around job design as a sort of part of that. Are there signals or sort of moves the Chancellor could indicate at the budget next week that could at least suggest that, to Helen's point around scaling up some of that pilot work or building on what seems to be working, that the government is going to be there to help and support, incentivise employers to do that?
I mean, you'd hope so, wouldn't you? But I'm inclined to agree with what Helen said. I mean, Helen said, I think in her opening remarks that this attempt to cut 5 billion out of the benefits bill through at the last moment in the run-up to the pre-budget report has had reversed eventually, as that's done an awful lot of damage. But I think, the broad point we have is, I think there's an awful lot of really good stuff in the employment rights, the employment rights reform bill legislation that's coming. I think it's really good, many of it. But there is, I think, a strategic question about you're pressing ahead with this employment rights bill, which tightens up lots of our labour market, makes it a lot less flexible, will hopefully in the medium term be good for workers. At the same time, you've pressed ahead with very large rises in the minimum wage, now taking our minimum wage as a share of the median wage to just about the highest in the OECD by most measures from very much not just 4 or 5 years ago. And you're doing both of these things at the same time, that you've done a big increase in national insurance contributions on employers a year ago, and at a time that your overall economy is quite a sluggish place. You're throwing an awful lot of grit into the labour market there. You're making hiring quite difficult, and it's quite hard to see how that links up with an agenda of trying to get more working age people off benefits and into work. Usually you'd want a much more expanding, looser labour market to achieve that. And I worry that's sort of the big strategic problem they've got, that I don't quite see how these two policy thrusts join up.
So thanks for that, Duncan. I definitely want to come back to particularly that point around national minimum wage and employment rights bill. But just before we do, and sticking on this sort of theme around health-related economic inactivity. So, just to come to you, I suppose my concern, or sort of one concern around some of this, is because of the sort of scheduling of when interventions will come into play, because of how hard we know it is to support people who have been out of the labour market back into the labour market, particularly if they've been out for some time. Are we really in a position where realistically the levels that we see today are likely to be the levels we see by the end of the Parliament? And so this sort of growth in health-related economic activity is here to stay, essentially, even if we think there are some really positive elements of the government's reform agenda.
Yeah, I think there is an element to that, certainly. I think we are still seeing some respects the legacy of COVID impact that's had on the labour markets. I think that's clear. And then I guess some of the feedback we've had, and I'd agree with Helen talked about the Mayfield report. I think it's an important starting point. But also, I think the big challenges, going back to what we hear from businesses, is that the cost element is a real challenge. They're open to things like pools, workforce, healthcare support, something like that. And because obviously business employees need to be obviously part of the solution, but clearly there is a cost barrier there already, which is creating a challenge. And I'd certainly echo what Duncan said around issues around the flexibility of the labour market is becoming less flexible for a number of reasons, but this is obviously one of those reasons. Tax is another, and that's what's creating a huge challenge as well, to deliver that sort of additional support as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Picking up that point around the national minimum wage, then clearly that is a big decision in terms of what happens next on that side of things. And Duncan, you sort of raised the prospect in your last remarks there that alongside all of these other interventions that may be becoming problematic for employers. But Helen, just to come to you, what would be the sort of big risks if the government did take the decision ahead of the budget to say not keep the national minimum wage rising either above the level of inflation or at the level of inflation? What are some of the risks if that is the decision it takes?
I think there is a very big difference between those two scenarios. I think keeping it rising with inflation just means you're not imposing an effective pay cut on a bunch of people. Raising it above inflation is obviously changing the structure of the labour market and of the wage structure. And that does quite risky. I mean, I think at the moment we're up at kind of around thirds of median wage, or we're getting there. That is what most economists think is about right. And there are diminishing returns, I think, from continually trying to push up that hourly wage. And I also think hourly low pay is one factor. But actually, when you look at people in in-work poverty, it tends to be people who are not able to have work full time or can't have at least 1.5 workers in the household. And for those people, just pushing up hourly pay, many of them are already above hourly pay, and just pushing it up is not necessarily going to be a game changer. There are other measures those households need to be able to have a decent standard. So I think it is, in the current circumstances, if we keep pushing it up, what we risk is that employers are even less willing to hire young people, disabled people, people who are perceived as more risky. I think devaluing it, though, would be a risk, because you are at a point when living standards at the bottom are really low and under a lot of pressure. I don't think we want to be actively making people poorer, but also we need to look at other levers and not just keep thinking minimum wage is how you change the labour market.
Yeah, fantastic. Is that Duncan, from your perspective, something you'd agree with? And I suppose also, just in terms of that broader picture you sort of painted around the pressures facing employers, do you think that's why potentially we've seen in particular this rise in NEETs, so an impact on young people who might be entering the labour market for the first time?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Helen said. And, I think it almost certainly is the case that, what would the NEET numbers look like if national insurance contributions hadn't gone up last year, if the minimum wage had risen by a bit less, because it was, again, quite a large above inflation increase? I suspect it would look, the picture would look a little bit better. Because, I think the moment you see any slowdown in the jobs market, you usually see it manifest, to start with, as we've seen over the last few months, in a slowdown in hiring rather than a rise in firings. And when you get a slowdown in hiring, the group most exposed to that are young people trying to get into the jobs market.
And in terms of staying with you, Duncan, in terms of that sort of broader point around what's the optimum level for the national minimum wage, where would you sit in terms of, and I'll come to you as well, Suren, for a view on this, in terms of, we should have it match in the rate of inflation today because of the sort of circumstantial factors that we have at the moment and previous policy choices made, versus something, I guess, a bit more of a profound statement which says, no, actually, I think we've sort of pushed that policy as far as it's likely to go for the foreseeable.
Well, we have pushed it as far as it's going to go for the foreseeable. I mean, it was a really big change 10 years ago. For the first 15 or so years, we had a minimum wage. Each year the low pay commission used to meet, and it used to recommend the largest increase it could, subject to not putting employment at risk, which is why we got all the sort of small increases for the first 10, 15 years. George Osborne changed it. He said, I'm setting this objective to get to 2/3 or so of median wages in a decade's time. So with that political direction, we've had this really quite big step up in the last decade. We've pretty much hit that target now. I don't think we can push it much further. And, we're in a strange world now where, it's not just that the minimum wage is quite high. What we've seen is differentials with supervisory staff in lots of industries like retail, like hospitality, vanish because the wage floor's been pushed up. Employers feel they can't pay supervisors much more. We're in a very strange world now where, the minimum wage, if you turn from an hourly figure to, a full-time equivalent, is butting up against the kind of numbers we see from a lot of graduate schemes. I think we're in a world now where you want to maintain the value of the minimum wage rather than use it as a policy lever push further.
Fantastic. Suren, just to get your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I certainly agree with those comments. I think you are getting to the stage where it's very much a delicate balancing act, given, as you say, national insurance rise in particular. I think, Ben, your slide right at the start, when you're looking at sort of wedge between youth unemployment and overall unemployment, is quite stark. And I think any downward pressure on that is form like a wage increase would be a real challenge. I wonder whether there should be a wide look. I know this is in the sort of smorgasbord of a budget speculation, but the big challenge for business, but also households in particular, is energy costs. And look at other areas to ease the burden a little bit. I'm not sure necessarily the pros around VAT is probably the best one, but I think some support there, I think is maybe more effective than an increase in above inflation increase in national minimum wage.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does seem in one way or another, the Chancellor may look at something in that space. Helen, just to stick for a sort of one final moment on this sort of issue around young people and the labour market. You mentioned before the kind of risks and the kind of quite strange connection that's been made between sort of making cuts in the welfare system and the youth guarantee that has been proposed. I also just wondered what your reflections were on the youth guarantee itself as a sort of mechanism to try and deal with some of this NEET issue. And certainly one sort of concern we would have, I think, is, at the moment, you'd have to be out of work and education and training for 18 months before this sort of guarantee sort of kicks in. That certainly feels like quite a long time to be sort of completely disconnected. I'm also not entirely sure whether that is even possible under the current welfare regime to sort of not be engaging within that period. But any other reflections you've got around sort of how the Chancellor might be able to strengthen the youth guarantee next week?
Yeah, I mean, youth guarantee is basically reinventing something that we now have pretty good evaluation evidence that worked when New Labour did their version of it. So I think it's good to see it coming back. I think that issue about the 18 months, I think it's genuinely a really hard policy one, because what you don't want is for it to kick in so soon that you basically displace people who would otherwise have gone into a kind of mainstream job or training and divert them into this scheme, because that will tend to reduce your overall outcomes. But you also, I agree, 18 months, it feels like quite a long time to leave people potentially in that limbo. So I think there is scope to bring it earlier, there is scope to expand it, but what you don't want is for it to kind of kick in for everybody within 3 months, because the dead weight costs of that would be enormous, and a whole bunch of people might have just gone on to another scheme and kind of been fine. So I think it is kind of about expanding it, bringing it forward, but not too far forward, and then just going as quickly as possible. I think a lot of the employment support stuff, it's really good plans, but some of it is they're not front loading it in the way that I think they probably could and should, to really in the first half of Parliament really try and turbocharge the better employment support that they're going to bring in, rather than waiting towards the end for it all to kick in.
Yes. Well, that's it. And I suppose the risk, at least 12 months ago, was we were going to see these front-loaded cuts, and then the employment support would come much later, which obviously isn't suitable. But I suppose, Duncan, the other sort of part of this equation is, it's given we've seen vacancies consistently falling now over many, many months, is around the sort of job creation side of things. And obviously particular parts of the country we know have relatively more depressed local economies. We've seen some sort of noises from the government around sort of clean energy job creation, and that they're going to kind of back that, tying into the modern industrial strategy. I just wondered what your reflections would be on the sort of role of government and the scope for the Chancellor next week to sort of signal, more investment on that side of the equation as well.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, completely. There is this kind of, the capital spending plans are in place. Quite a bit of that is on what should be relatively employment intensive areas. I think there's a huge opportunity in the medium term, if the government is serious on following through in terms of construction jobs, in terms of, a rising share of the workforce working there. Again, though, this tends to be stuff which I think we're going to start to see the fruits of in the late 2020s, the early 2030s. Although, construction is an interesting one. The percentage of the percentage of those in employment working in construction fell in the most recent figures to the lowest since about 2000, a 25-year low percentage of the employed workforce working in construction. Now, we know house building numbers are fairly grim, but if you want house building to increase towards this government target of 1.5 million over the Parliament, if you want the infrastructure spending and plans to come off, then we are going to have to see those numbers rise. And that sometimes feels like the missing link between these medium-term macroeconomic objectives, short to medium-term skills policy. Because if we want to, if we want many more British people to be working in construction, then the routes into that kind of work need to be there in terms of apprenticeships, in terms of skills, in terms of continuous professional development.
Absolutely. Suren, would you be able to pick up that theme maybe from Duncan there, just in terms of the skills the skills gaps that we do know exist in some of these kind of growth sectors? The government have obviously taken some steps in the first 12, 18 months around the creation of Skills England, modern industrial strategy, etc. How confident are you that when it comes to things like the construction sector, we will be able to sort of build that pipeline of talent that's going to be required?
In the short term, not very. based on some of the research we do, so one of the things we track is we track a number of indicators around investment, and one of the indicators areas we track is investing in training and skills. And what we see is that pretty much called all sectors, particularly construction, in fact, that cutting investment as a result of some of the stuff we talked earlier, that big increase in costs on business and staff training and general workforce training has been stripped back. I think what other elements. I mean, I think, and talking about something the government has done quite well, is the new industrial strategy that was launched a few months ago. I think that's a useful North Star for the wider economy in terms of where you want to target some of these policies, whether it is job creation, whether it's wider increase in productivity, or those sort of things. I think that's going to be a really important thing, those sort of 8 sectors that are targeted for growth. And I think those are sort of a key sort of plan going forward to try and deal with some of those things. But I think just lastly on the point Duncan made, I think the challenge is that the political cycle is a lot shorter than the economic cycle to deal with some of these things. And that's, I mean, that's obviously a big issue, but never say more than it is at the moment.
And so just on that point around the modern industrial strategy and the sort of growth sectors, so would you expect to see then the Chancellor almost use that framework for any additional investment that we may see coming next week?
Yeah, that's the hope, and we can speak as the institute. Obviously, professional business services is one of those sort of 8 sectors, and there's clearly a lot of work, a lot of focus in driving, in looking at what can drive faster growth in those sectors, and as well as looking at technology, AI is obviously one of those sort of cost-cutting things across a number of those sectors. So there's a clear focus on those. So expect some of that in the budget in particular. And I think that's the other thing, we should talk about taxes in one area, but obviously what's a long-term growth plan, and clearly industrial strategy is going to be an important part of that.
Yes. I'm going to sort of begin to draw us to a conclusion quite soon, and I want to ask each of you in a moment for a sort of 60-second answer around what the Chancellor should really prioritise next week, given the context which we've been discussing this morning. But just before that, I just to quickly get a couple of reflections. I mean, because I think it's been a sort of theme of the conversation really around the sort of cumulative impact of policy decisions that have been taken, and the sort of sequencing then of when reforms come into place. So Duncan, you mentioned before, and I know you have to end a little bit early, Duncan, so I'll come to you first on this. This idea that the sort of cumulative impact of employment rights reforms, national minimum wage, etc. Well, one of the responses from government, it seems to me, has been to sort of defer the introduction of some of this to sort of later in the Parliament. We've seen a similar approach on the Mayfield recommendations. Are there not risks in this then that essentially you're not really getting on with the reform that you yourself, your own strategic reviews have said is required in order to get us into a better place in the first place?
Again, apologies to leave early. I think that is completely the risk. And I think actually, wider than just the labour market and the economy, I think, the real problem, one real problem this government has had is that if they can find a way to try and address a problem without their way of addressing it having a direct impact on the public finances, that's become much more attractive to them. So why so much talk about planning reform as growth? Because planning reform, doesn't cost the government direct money. If they can find a social policy problem and they can try and find a way to put the costs of that on employers rather than on the government balance sheet, that's generally the road they've gone down. And I think the problem is cumulatively, quite a big burden has been put on employers by all of this. Lots of it's stuff that, would make more sense that the government was doing it directly. That would have an impact on the public finances. And I think that's sort of there hasn't been a confidence in making the argument that taxes are going to have to be higher to pay for some of this stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Duncan, for that. And you're good to drop off the call now if that works for you. Helen, just coming to you, because I mean, you made, I think, a very compelling case around the importance of, in particular, making work more secure as a key sort of element of, making those at the lower end of the labour market's lives much more stable, predictable, able to kind of then, improve their living standards over time. Presumably, then you wouldn't accept the argument that we can't achieve growth and make work more secure at the same time, and we do need to prioritise getting on with some of those reforms.
Yes, I think, it goes both ways, but I think there is evidence that if you improve the quality of work, that does knock on into productivity and retention and some of those other things. And also, lots and lots of employers won't be affected by the Employment Rights Bill because they already choose to provide secure work with proper notice of shifts and so on. So to some extent, what we're doing is levelling up employers using those practices for perfectly understandable reasons, but they're using practices that damage their workers, and they can essentially undercut businesses that don't do that. So I think there is a good argument to press ahead. I think it is very unfortunate, though, that the government decided to go for raising employer NI as their key tax share and directly raising costs on employers at the same time as those reforms. I mean, I think it's one of those with that budget and this budget. From a policy perspective, the ideal budget is kind of big tax rises because they're less economically distortive and very targeted help with cost of living for those at the bottom facing severe hardship. However, in politics terms, it will often feel easier to do the smorgasbord of tax rises and big blunt cost of living support. I think is one of those areas where policy and politics do slightly kind of clash. But that, you know, that we should be targeting on people who really need extra help and trying to make sure employers have a fair wind to deal with these reforms. But I don't think the answer is not reforming.
Fantastic. And so before we sort of round up the conversation, almost to come back to one of your first points, I think, in your introductory remarks, what would you say in terms of the really important things for the Chancellor next week to learn the lessons, essentially, of the last budget? So thinking about not making similar missteps, potentially, that could then undermine the wider agenda that the government's looking to pursue.
Sure.
So I say what? Oh, sorry, is that me or Suren?
No, sorry, that was to Suren, Helen. Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, as an economist sitting in a building of accountants, I guess that's probably shaped my answer a little bit. And I think that the one thing that she should be thinking about, and I think it's a mistake from previous budgets, is as much as the tax rates, is obviously, I think a key element is tax reform, making this tax system much more easier, because that will help growth, also help raise revenue better than it is at the moment, a more efficient tax system. And we often hear loads of issues around trying to understand, changes in the tax system, some of the quirks that we've seen from these sort of myriad of measures that came in last budget was a huge issue as well. And one example of this would be making VAT much more simpler than it is at the moment. One thing we'd like to see as an institute is the government move towards also kick off the transition towards a single rate of VAT. Because that'll take a huge amount of complexity out of the system as well. Similarly with business rates as well. The business rate system is hideously complex and doesn't really fit with the wider economy. So looking at reforming that as well, and real fundamental reform is, we think, is a key priority as well. So as much as tax rates, I want to hear about reform as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Suren. And Helen, I'll come to you for the last word in terms of your big priority for the Chancellor next week.
I mean, my priority is there are millions of people who can't afford to put food on the table. And that is bad for us as a country, and it's bad for our economy. So we need to see some serious action to change that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers. I think that just about brings us to a close in terms of the conversation. Thanks also to all of you for attending the event this afternoon, and for the colleagues in the Work Foundation team who lead on producing both our labour market analysis and also on putting sessions like this together. You can, of course, keep up to date on our response at the Work Foundation to the budget next week via our website and via our social media channels, where you'll also be able to find out more on all of our latest research and analysis. For now, though, thank you once again. I hope you found the discussion valuable and in that you enjoy the rest of your day.